our Black Jewish Dialogue. We took off the month of December. I hope everybody had good holidays and a nice, relaxing and pleasant New Year as we move into this new and hopefully, what we hoped, better time. We still have a chance in the rest of 2021. But hang on a second, I gotta spotlight myself. As we start our important work, I think it's important to acknowledge a couple things. And that is, first, I don't want anything to overshadow at the beginning of this week that we had in Georgia a Jewish son of an immigrant and a Black son of a woman who picked cotton elected to the Senate in a very deep South state. And apropos of our meeting, these two gentlemen campaigned together. And we also should note that both of them had strong ties and inspiration from the inimitable John Lewis of blessed memory. And Senator Ossoff and Senator Warnock represent the best of our communities, and they represent the best of our country. And they represent the hope that we're going to overcome the ugliness that happened just the very next day after the election. So we do take a moment to mourn and lament. We live with constant knowledge that our work is never done, and it's really just begun. And so that means that our work today, building alliances and strengthening an ever important and historic bond, and learning and listening to each other is all the more important. So I want to just offer a quick prayer that we find in the Reformed Jewish prayer book, Mishkan Tefillah, Prayer for Our Country. And it begins with the words of Isaiah. Thus says Adonai our God, this is what I desire, to unlock the fetters of wickedness and unite the cords of lawlessness, to let the oppressed go free, to break off every yoke, share your bread with the hungry, and take the wretched poor into your home. When you see the naked, give clothing, and do not ignore your own kin. If you banish the yoke from your midst, the menacing hand, the evil speech, if you offer compassion to the hungry and satisfy the famished creature, then your light shall shine in darkness. And therefore we pray, O guardian of life and liberty, may our nation always merit your protection. Teach us to give thanks for what we have by sharing it with those who are in need. Keep our eyes open to the wonders of creation and alert to the care of the earth. May we never be lazy in the work of peace. May we honor those who have died in defense of our ideals. Grant our leaders wisdom and forbearance. May they govern with justice and compassion. Help us to appreciate one another and to respect the many ways that we may serve you. May our homes be safe from affliction and strife, and may our country be sound in body and spirit. And we can say,
Amen.
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 And so on that note, we transition to not just important, but what truly is sacred work, and that is unity. I am delighted to welcome our two guest speakers, and I thank Deborah Levine for arranging this and coordinating it. As I look over their bios, I've not met either of you gentlemen, but I'm really looking forward to hearing you speak. We have Mike Green and Dov Wilker. Mike Green is an award-winning journalist headquartered in Colorado. He's also a co-founder of Scale Up Partners, LLC, a nationally networked consulting practice. Its focus is on changing the nation's economic narrative, cultivating a national movement around inclusive competitiveness, economic strategies, and assisting in developing economic infrastructure designed to connect economically disconnected populations with local innovation ecosystems. He's currently the Chief Economic Strategist for the National Institute for Inclusive Competitiveness, the NIICUSA.org, and also he's the co-founder of Common Ground Conversations on Race in America. And that is quite a CV that I hope that I could even begin to come close to matching one day. And we also have with us Dov Wilker, who has been the regional director for the American Jewish Committee, the American Jewish Committee, Atlanta Regional Office since 2011. And their goal is enhancing the well-being of the Jewish people worldwide and advancing human rights and democratic values in the United States and around the world. The office has worked with the Atlanta Black Jewish Coalition for nearly 35 years. And I really can't wait to hear you describe your work and also some plans that you might consider. And I know Daisy here is really looking forward to it too. I'm humbled by you being here today, and I just want to step back and let you gentlemen begin. As questions trickle in, I invite people, rather than just raising hands at first while our presenters are talking, you can send questions through the chat function. And when we have some opportunities to maybe pause and break, we will then ask the questions. Okay, so I will change the spotlight over to, I think we'll just go in the order of the introductions that I was able to make. So Mike, we're going to start with you. And you have the floor, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'd like to start off by introducing the idea that what we're seeing today unfold in our society is not new. It is a conversation that we've been having in this country since the country began. And what I mean by that, and I'll get to why I do what I do through this narrative. And what I mean by that is this country began, it was established by the visitors from a continent who brought with them the ideology of rugged individualism versus collectivism, what they found here, and the idea of ownership, that when they arrived here on this continent, filled with more than 600 nations of brown people who shared resources and land and resources for millennia, the idea of ownership and development of individual wealth, individual prosperity through ownership, clashed with the culture of sharing resources and lands. And that clash was also based upon this ideology of white supremacy, this racial hierarchy of human value, where white men were at the top and Black people at the bottom, and everyone was valued in some way, shape, or form in between. And so we've been having this conversation from the beginning of this country, which was established as a whites-only citizenry, for the entire time this country's been in existence. Now, this is not a conversation that is being held just between white people and non-white people. It is a conversation that is being held among white people themselves. And we saw that in the Civil War. So up until the Civil War, this nation is a whites-only citizenry. The Civil War changed that by releasing or freeing the 4 million Black slaves, 4 million Black people who were held as slaves. But that release didn't actually change the citizenry of this country. It took acts of Congress in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. Congress introduced the Freedmen's Bureau and Bank to economically empower Black people. And the prioritization of the economic and political empowerment of Black people really became the #1 focus of white radical, they were called radicals in Congress, because the idea was that this was no longer going to be a whites-only citizenry. It was now going to be a multicultural society and with a infrastructure of equity and inclusion. And in order to build that inclusive America, they didn't have to change the people, they had to change the systems. So they changed the Constitution 3 times, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. They added the very first Civil Rights Act, of which there have been 8 in 1866. They impeached a white supremacist president who opposed all of that. And they began the building of HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, that building lasted for more than 100 years. Plus, they empowered Black people to begin to build their own towns, not just communities, but entire towns, of which they built more than 200 in the first 20 years. So prosperity and the access to resources to develop prosperity was something that came through the Congress. It came through political means. It came through systemic change. But no systemic change is going to be made in this country without backlash. By 1872, the white radicals were out. And now you had the Amnesty Act and you had white supremacists that came back into Congress. By 1877, they had the Great Compromise, which removed the troops from the South. And of course, that precipitated the Great Migration, because by the time you get to 1896, when the Supreme Court officially declared this nation two separate societies, one white, wealthy, and powerful, and the other one Black, poor, and powerless, by the time you get to that decision, more than 58,000 Black people had been murdered. And so now you have Black people scattered all over this nation, seeking refuge, seeking opportunity, seeking civil rights, seeking the humanity that Dr. King talked about, the humanity that A. Philip Randolph talked about, that humanity that our Jewish brothers and sisters, when they helped form the NAACP in 1909, talked about. So the idea of changing this nation from a whites-only citizenry, from white supremacy, to an equitable, multicultural, inclusive America, that conversation is the conversation we've been having. And every time the systems are disrupted, there is a backlash. When we saw in 1954, the Supreme Court said Brown v. Board of Education, desegregate the schools with all deliberate speed. By 1958, they introduced the pupil placement law, which nullified the Brown v. Board of Education and completely stopped the desegregation of schools. Dr. King wrote about it in his book, Why We Can't Wait, which in 1963, this book chronicles the uprising of what Dr. King called the Negro Revolution. That's the very first chapter of his book. It's called The Negro Revolution, why 1963. And that revolution rose up on the centennial, 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, when Black people realized we not only are not free, but the Supreme Court that gave us some hope that our children would be educated in this country took away that hope. And so now our children have no hope. The housing that we live in, which redline communities, the wealth was being destroyed that Black people had built for more than 100 years. It was being destroyed both by a vigilante and by systemic public policies, urban planning. That was part of the demands for the Negro American Revolution when it rose up in 1963 as a nonviolent direct action protest in nearly 1,000 cities that we don't teach in any schools to this day. And yet it had three demands: in segregation in schools, in discrimination in housing, in discrimination in banking and access to capital. Those were the three demands. To this day, we still don't talk about those things. And all three of those measures are worse today than they were on the day that Dr. King spoke on the Washington Mall, when he said, the Negro is still not free. The Negro still lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. The first refrain of his I Have a Dream speech is his reality. 100 years later, 100 years later, he says this over and over and over until he says, and so we've come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. That shameful condition is measured. And we can see those measures have worsened in the 52 years since Dr. King died. So now, every time we see the uprising of nonviolent protests, we saw it in 1965 in Selma, and we saw the backlash, the violent backlash. We saw it in 1967, and we saw the violent backlash across 164 cities. We saw it in 1968 when Dr. King was killed. And then from 1960 to 1968, when you had the Black vote uh, uh, you have the black vote move John F. Kennedy into the White House over Nixon. From that day to the end of the 1960 era, in 1968, where Nixon won in a landslide, you saw John F. Kennedy assassinated. You saw Malcolm X assassinated. You saw MLK assassinated and Bobby Kennedy assassinated. All the voices that rose up talking about a multicultural society and building an inclusive America were cut down by violence. And from Nixon to now, we have seen that every time the voices of protest rise up to change these systems that protect white supremacy, these 20th century segregationist policies and practices that we inherited, every time we seek to disrupt them, the voices of violence and vitriol rise up in order to cut down that effort. And that's what we saw after Obama was elected president. We saw the backlash. And now we see after the election of Biden and we see the election of our friends in Georgia, John Ossoff and Pastor Raphael Warnock, who is, by the way, the pastor of MLK's old church, we see the violent backlash. It is a common conversation we are having. And what I do at the National Institute for Inclusive Competitiveness is we prioritize the increased productivity of the most vulnerable populations. And we use their progress as a barometer of success of all economic strategies at all levels of governance. So I'm sorry to take so long. That's a long-winded answer, but a long-winded introduction. But I wanted to give you some background around what the way I approach what I do, the work that I do, and the passion that I have behind it. And I look forward to a conversation around it.
So I did see a question pop up, and I think it is apropos of something that you just talked about. So we'll take that question, and then we'll turn it over to Dove, and then we'll let both of you field questions, and perhaps we can just have an engaging conversation. So Richard Zachary asks us, why after Obama was elected was the conversation among many that we had become a post-racial society?
It's a very good question. And here's why I think that is true. It's because we don't know our history. It is impossible to have read Dr. King's book, Why We Can't Wait, which is a full description of the Negro American Revolution and its 3 demands, and know the measures of those demands then and now. It is impossible to think we're post-racial when you know that conversation's ongoing to this day. That revolution is still in process to this day. It didn't die with Dr. King. It is impossible to think that if you know that in 1965, the report that was published by the Department of Labor called The Negro Family, The Case for National Action, said that in our lifetime and in the next several generations, the Negro will continue to encounter considerable prejudice. And here's the reason why. And they gave 2 reasons. They said the first reason is because the racist virus still afflicts America. That's the first reason. The second reason is said because the 300 plus odd years that the Negro has been in America at that time, he has been crippled. And so he has no capacity without a national action. He has no capacity to compete in a tech-based, globally competitive innovation economy that we're living in now, fueled by a 4th industrial revolution that's increasing the pace of obsolescence as we speak. We don't have the infrastructure in our communities. If you look across the country, ubiquitously, all of the worst schools serve the most vulnerable and most needy population in our country. Come on now, Christ wouldn't have created that. What kind of system is that? And how can we look at it objectively and think that it's going to magically change on its own? It's not. We have to change our attitudes. We have to change the systems because we control those schools. We control how we are treating our children, who we say education is the key to success, education is the escape from poverty, and yet our actions say that we serve them with our worst schools in the richest nation on the planet. We cannot possibly think that we have come to a post-racial society when in 1968, the Kerner Commission said that the reason ghettos exist is because white institutions created them. White society condones it to this day. We cannot possibly think that the systems of education, the systems of housing, and the systems of banking and finance in this country have magically changed since they were the top demands in the 1960s with the Negro American Revolution. And we cannot know anything about the Negro American Revolution, which, by the way, the 1965 Department of Labor report says the Negro American Revolution is the most important event in the history of the United States, and it actually compares it to the American Revolution itself. We know that report as the Moynihan Report, which is the politicization of that report. But if you actually read the report, the very first chapter, just like the very first chapter of Dr. King's book, is the Negro American Revolution, why it's the most important thing in American history. How can we know that and think that this is a post-racial society when we're still having that conversation? We have not even begun to change those systems, and you didn't hear a word about it in the presidential campaigns last year.
Well, Micah, thank you so much, and I really appreciate what you said about education, because I'm going to offer a shameless plug for just a moment, and that is in the social justice commentary from the Central Conference of American Rabbis. The chapter that I was asked to write is about that very topic. So it's coming out in the spring, and something that I find incredibly important and learned so much just in my research for it. So folks, when that comes out, we can continue that conversation, and I'd be happy to talk about some of the research that I did on that in the process. Okay, and then also one more quick shameless plug. I meant to mention this at the beginning, and that is if you look in the chat room, you'll see there's a link about or a document that you can download about the Jewish documentary film series from the local Jewish Federation. And most importantly, the very first film in that series is, I'm going to read the title for you here. I mention it because this group especially, it's important too. It's called Shared Legacies, the African American Jewish Civil Rights Alliance. This film is about the often forgotten story of the coalition and friendship between the two communities. Thursday evening, there will be a Zoom panel discussion about Chattanooga's African American Jewish role in the civil rights movement. And there's a trailer that you can catch on YouTube. You can download that document and you can find out how to register. You can either sign up for the whole documentary series or you can sign up for just one particular film. All right. So, and without any further ado, I'd like to turn over to our friend Dov down in Atlanta. Even though we haven't met, I'm sure we have lots of friends in common. So
not only that, Rabbi, but I see that you went to the University of Kansas, where my wife is an alum. So, you know, it's never.
What's your wife's name?
Her name is Julie Jacobson. She's from Wichita.
No kidding.
Yeah.
My brother was the Hillel director there for many, many years.
Okay, we'll talk about that the next time we the next time we connect. Well, I wanted to first thank you all so much for having me. It was a really enlightening actually to hear from Mike first as a part of the program. So a little bit of an edit on my bio. So I'm the regional director for American Jewish Committee. I'm also AJC's national director for Black Jewish Relations. And it's not just that we've been involved with the work of the Atlanta Black Jewish Coalition, but rather the Atlanta Black Jewish Coalition is a project or an initiative of AJC. So we are, it is part of the ethos of the work that we do. So the reason for American Jewish Committee, just to sort of give a little bit of framing around this too, AJC is a global Jewish advocacy organization, and we're actually the oldest of the Jewish human relations organizations, founded in 1906. But our first advocacy, in fact, on behalf of non-Jews, was in fact on behalf of Catholic parochial schools in Portland, Oregon, because there was the state government was trying to prevent the eligibility of those schools. So as we talk about education, right? There's education has affected many. It clearly has had an incredibly outsized impact negatively on the Black community, but there's been a lot of advocacy related to education from within the Jewish community. And then since that time, AJC has been involved with intergroup relations, interreligious work, diplomatic work, and sort of general advocacy in the US, especially when it comes to combating anti-Semitism and creating relationships for Israel. But Mike mentioned 1954, the Brown versus Board of Education. Actually, that was AJC's research was cited in the Supreme Court decision in favor of Brown v. Board. So our connections to the Black community is something that's been really going on for decades. Most recently, I will share, I think that's really the best way for us to frame it. I've been in my position for my secondary position for just over 2 years now. And with that, we've focused on sort of 3 areas now. One is on the congressional side. So we helped to launch the Congressional Caucus for Black-Jewish Relations, which is a bipartisan caucus that was founded, created by Congresswoman Brenda Lawrence from Detroit, and then Republican Black Congressman who's since retired, Will Hurd from Texas, Republican Jewish Congressman Lee Zeldin, Debbie Wasserman Schultz from Florida, and then John Lewis of blessed memory, who actually helped to found the Atlanta Black Jewish Coalition in 1982. The second piece that we've been working on is really creating sort of understanding between our communities. So in September of this year, we helped to launch Black Jewish Unity Week in partnership with the National Urban League. The National Urban League, that partnership created sort of 3 programs. One was a conversation between our CEOs about the importance of this relationship. Number 2 was, and I heard somebody asking earlier about Rabbi Sandra Lawson, it was about the role of Black Jews in this current conversation in strengthening the relationship of Black Jewish relations. Something we don't often talk about when it comes to Black Jewish relations is actually religious diversity in the Black community. In Atlanta, for instance, about 35% of the Muslim community is African American. And while the Jewish community has there's about 1,000 Jews of color in the Atlanta Jewish community, the numbers are significantly smaller. It's still an important part of the conversation. We have to make sure to be inclusive of the diversity that we have within our own Jewish community. And then the third issue that we tackled through my work is anti-Semitic attitudes in the Black community. That is a key issue, especially because of the sad influence that Louis Farrakhan has, especially with celebrities. So in the summertime, there were a number of very high-profile instances of entertainers and athletes who were quoting Louis Farrakhan, and without realizing the magnitude and the issue that places for us in the Jewish community. So we spent a lot of time in those 3 areas. As we think about Black-Jewish relations, it has really been an ebb and flowing relationship. You can actually go back to the early 1900s, to before Brown versus Board of Education, around the time of the founding of the NAACP, to the creation of Rosenwald schools. So how many? I see some of you on video. How many of you are familiar with Rosenwald schools? Okay, all right. So for those of you who don't, Rosenwald schools are, I would almost argue, one of the most important elements of education that helped to expand the Black community. So Julius Rosenwald, a Jewish philanthropist, was the CEO of Sears. Happened to be a founder of AJC. I think he was involved in the founding of the NAACP. In partnership with Booker T. Washington, realized that they needed to create schools. So the way they did that was Rosenwald committed to 1/3 of the funding for the school. The local Black community committed to 1/3 of the funding from the school, and then the local government actually committed to 1/3 of the funding for the school. And those schools were scattered across the United States, although they were primarily in the South. They ended up educating some 50,000 students or something like that. And many of the prominent, I think Jim Clyburn, I think, went to a Rosenwald school. They were very well known in the Black community because of the way that they were developed and how important they were. Right? But Black-Jewish relations wasn't just about Rosenwald schools, and it wasn't just about the civil rights movement. Black-Jewish relations has always been about the shared advocacy interest of our two communities. So in the 70s and 80s, while in the civil rights movement, a lot of many in the Jewish community were advocating for the Black community. In the 70s and 80s, many in the Black community were advocating for Jewish issues. They were advocating for Soviet Jewry. They were advocating against Zionism as racism at the United Nations. They were advocating for Israel, and sadly, in the 90s and the 2000s, I think sort of the conversation around Black-Jewish relations, while it always was there, that shared advocacy, that shared partnership sort of went away a little bit. But what we've seen, especially in the last decade, has been a renewed interest in the notion of Black-Jewish relations. I mean, it was already mentioned about my two new senators, Reverend Warnock and John Ossoff. Now, there's been a lot of talk about, are they the sort of their Black-Jewish relationship? But the fact is that, Reverend Warnock's relationship to the Jewish community is not John Ossoff. Reverend Warnock's relationship to the Jewish community is the Jewish community. It is Rabbi Peter Berg, the senior rabbi at the temple. It's the relationship between Ebenezer Baptist Church and the temple. It's the influence that, frankly, Martin Luther King's relationship and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel had on the way that we, at least in Atlanta, view Black-Jewish relations as something to be committed to, as something to be involved with. And although there is not always 100% mutual agreement on what those shared advocacy issues should be, there is always been, and I believe will continue to be, an acknowledgement of the importance of how we advocate and how we engage together. I'm proud to say that, not just in Atlanta, but really across the country, there are lots of Black-Jewish initiatives. So Philadelphia and DC both have programs for young professionals, for high school students. In New York, they have a clergy roundtable. In Seattle, Washington, there's a rabbi and a Black minister who are friends who've gotten their congregations together. So it's, and I can't forget, one of the amazing changes that we've actually seen has been the way that we have understood the role, the U.S.-Israel relationship, and the role and understanding of the Black community and helping to advocate for Israel, especially over the past 15 years. So I think with that, I will, there's a lot more I could talk about on this topic. I've given hour-long presentations, but I'm just happy to be here and to know that this is something that y'all care deeply about and are committed to on a Sunday afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dov. Going to go back to just gallery view for a moment, and then we'll see if there's any questions that pop in. Deborah, I see raising your hand physically. By the way, it's easiest if you can find the raise hand function on Zoom, which if you go to the participants, find your name under participants and click on the thing that says at the bottom. Wait.
Okay.
I just said it, but now I'm not finding it myself.
No.
But there's a, well, I don't see it. Shoot. Well, anyway, we'll do our best. If you can chat the question in, if we don't acknowledge you, we'll do our best. But there still should be the raise hand function, which for some reason isn't popping up. Okay.
Okay.
I saw Deborah. We'll start with you.
Well, I want to thank both of you. I know you from different places. Mike and I have known each other for many years, and I've always admired his work and his journalism, his work in schools. Dov, we haven't met before, but you know that I've worked for the American Jewish Committee as the Interreligious Affairs Director in Chicago for many years. And here we are doing this. My question to both of you is, what do you think will come of our Black-Jewish dialogues? What is the best outcome that you see in the next, say, year or two? What is your vision?
I'll let Dove go first. You know?
Oh, give me the softball here. Look, I think there's a few things that I think would be the best outcome. Look, number one, to me, it's all, so for American Jewish Committee, we're an advocacy organization, and I say if there's not an advocacy component to it, then it's not something that we should be doing. However, I place the caveat with that as within the Black-Jewish relationship, I believe that actually relationship building is the most important thing that you can do. I believe that understanding, who everybody is as individuals, understanding their challenges and opportunities that the communities face. I think that if in a year you can sort of say, oh, all right, I now have friends, not just people that I meet with quarterly, but like friends. I think that is that's the number one outcome to be able to have. And I think the secondary outcome that you should have is that people continue to come back, right? That you're able to bring in more people to this conversation. I always feel that people will come to the first meeting because they're interested. They'll come to the second meeting because the first meeting was interesting. They'll come to the third meeting because, okay, like this or two. But then when we come to the fourth is really based on what is it that we hope to achieve and what are the opportunities we are providing. So the film that you're opening your film festival with, I will share, like AJC is a financial supporter of. We were heavily involved in connecting the filmmaker with people to be interviewed. I was interviewed, but I guess I wasn't good looking enough. They didn't include me in the film. But it's a wonderful film that helps to stoke further conversation. But I think the continuance of opportunities together is sort of a second tremendous outcome. Mike?
So I want to piggyback on that. I think that developing a shared vision for the nation itself, because the relationships between the Jewish and Black communities have to be purposeful. And I think that we have shared ideals and shared ideas, but I don't know that there's a shared vision for the nation itself that I think that could be identified. If that's something that over the next year can happen, we come up with a agreed upon shared outcome as a vision for the nation. What are we working toward? And then to come up with some sort of strategy to educate America through the lens of historical context, because we have zero chance of changing the status quo if we don't know the inheritance that we've received as a society and what we want to change and how to change it toward the vision that we aspire to achieve. So I think those two things, having a shared vision and educating America through the lens of historical context, because our communities, as you said before, have been working throughout history, but how much of America knows that? And what are we working toward, and how do we get there? I think that would be a couple of really good things to work toward.
We have two hands raised. So I'll go first Earl, and then to Jan after that. Jan Armstrong Cobb. And by the way, Deb Dubow noted that it's under the reactions now. Tells you how long it's been since I've been a participant in a meeting where I've had to raise my hand. Okay, so Earl.
Yes, I think that one of the concrete things that we can do as a group is to get a legislator involved and get some legislation going where we can in Chattanooga and make it work. And then the people in the rest of the country will have something to look at.
I'll get one.
Please, if you're not speaking, mute. If I click mute all, I might cut off a questioner or a speaker. So if you are not directly involved, please remember to mute yourself. Okay. So Earl, was that just a comment, or is there a follow-up?
Well, Deborah asked what's the best outcome we could have for this group. And my suggestion is to get a legislator involved so that we can come up with something concrete for our community. And then if it works here,
Okay.
maybe we can make it work elsewhere.
Great. Okay, so Jan.
So I'm a bit of an interloper here because I'm from Cincinnati, but I don't.
I used to live in Blue Ash. Welcome.
Okay, great. So right now I'm a member of 3 different groups that are talking about Black-Jewish relations and racism. And I think what Earl just said is a good way to go. And I keep thinking we've got this Black Jewish caucus in Congress. Is that too lofty to start with to have them get involved in this? But in Cincinnati we've had our issues with being kind of a segregated city, and everybody's trying to work toward that. But I know people want to be able to do something. We can educate ourselves, we can talk, but then we have to do, and that's the hard part. So I don't know. To me, I'd always I want to have Debbie Wasserman Schultz come and talk to me about how to get things done. So, but yeah. So that's my comment.
Thank you. Go enjoy some graders when we're all done too. So I think I saw next was Bill, who changed his last name. William Howard.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Rabbi. And I really wanted to just commend what I just heard from Mike and Dove. I think there's no relationship without communication. You can't relate to anybody unless you are able to talk to them and do that on a fairly consistent basis. So I think going forward, keeping dialogue going, understanding, as Mike pointed out, the history of what has happened in this country. And Mike, I'll take us back to even before 1619, with many of the things that occurred to set up what we see reflected in the Constitution of the United States, which puts particularly Americans of African descent behind the 8 ball, but excluded Jewish people as well. We need to understand all of that so that as we go forward, we can put a really seriously good picture together of what this country should be, as opposed to what we may think it should be. But that can't happen unless we understand very clearly and in a comprehensive way, just what has happened to us, what's going on here, identified clearly, and then move in a direction that we want to go, knowing where we've been. So I think that dialogue is really important. And I think it's something that a lot of us don't realize there's that history of it. But it needs to inform, where we're going, what strategy we may choose to employ going forward.
Thank you, Bill. Deborah.
Yeah, thank you. I agree. I think, certainly legislation is important and certainly getting people aware of the history. But I guess where my mind keeps going on this is certainly encouraging the dialogue and having more opportunities to have dialogue in the wider community, because, the group here is, obviously the people that are supporters or the believers, or, you don't have to convert them. But I think about how do we have dialogue more with the non-converters? How do we create that space to have more of those discussions and open it up in the community? I'm interested in that because, what I saw this week in Washington not only was so offensive and horrendous, but it also showed the degree of hate. And so how do we create more conversations, even in our immediate community, to allow people to just have more dialogue and open up conversation? Because I think that's where it starts, to share our differences and to share what we have in common. And I don't know how to do that, but I think it has to start at the dialogue level.
Dialogue is essential. I think that's why we said, so this summer, I was thinking, what can we do? And it really started with as there were more and more celebrities that were making anti-Semitic comments, football players and actors and things like that, that would normally not be aligned with, obviously not white supremacy because they were African American. I said, well, something's broken. And the only way to find out what's broken is to engage the conversation and to try and do what we can to mend the relationship. And starting from here. And so I think we have a bunch of interested parties, and we've made a lot of friends along the way mutually. So I think it's really incredibly important. Any other comments or questions? I see Richard Zachary just raised his hand. If you have already spoken, can you go ahead and unraise your hand, which is also another button under reactions, I think.
And just a quick comment, Rabbi, you say the situation is broken. I
didn't say the situation, I said something is broken, right?
Excuse me, so, thank you.
Yeah.
Something is broken. I beg to tweak the grammar a little bit, or the syntax, or the word selection. As the speakers have pointed out, our system has never been, what's the opposite of unbroken? It's never been totally fixed. It just continues to bend all the time. And our job is, of course, to continue to bend it back towards a more moral universe, to paraphrase Dr. King.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Marissa.
Yeah, I think, what stands out to me, and one of the things that you talked about, Mike, was the backlashes that happen against the systems that we have. So my question is, how do we change these systems? Because that's where the problem is. And when you've got people who are not committed to that, then I don't know that you need, I think, I like the idea of getting a legislator involved. If we could have a city council member or something come to join to one of our groups, that would be helpful for us, I think.
Well, let me offer you this. One of the things that I find hopeful is what my wife and I do with Common Ground Conversations on Race. We're in Southern Oregon, and the vast majority of the groups and the organizations and institutions that we facilitate are white Christian conservative evangelical churches and schools and libraries. But we live in a community that's 87% white. And what we have found, and what we're educating our community about, is that they don't know their history. And so when we talk about changing systems, we find that people don't even understand the systems that currently govern them. They don't understand, for example, that Oregon was established as a white utopia in 1859. It was established as a white state. The Constitution itself had a clause that if you were Black and lived in this state, you could be whipped every 6 months until you left. So even though it was a free state, it was established for white people.
Amazing.
And so when you begin to talk to people through our conversations that we have, the first thing we do, and we have a formula, we establish a set of common ground information, knowledge, and we then establish a reference, a reference for common ground. Do we all believe in human value? Do we all believe that humans are equally valued? Children believe that. At what point do we grow up and start to not believe that? Do we believe that our systems reflect our values? And then we start talking about specific systems, and we specifically derive those talking points from the Negro Revolution, the demand for desegregated schools, racially desegregated schools, the demand for equitable housing. And I'm not talking about equitable, affordable housing. I'm talking about ownership. Equity equals ownership. I'm talking about access to resources, capital resources, banking, and access to capital and things of that nature. And most people don't understand how the systems have eroded people's capacity to engage in the American experiment. For example, today, home ownership among Black people is at the same rate it was in the 1950s and 60s, around 44%, versus 76% home ownership for white America. Our businesses, 2.6 million Black-owned businesses, which have skyrocketed since the 1970s, still produce less than 1% GDP. We're talking 155 years after slavery, and all of our activity has produced in productivity less than 1% GDP. You could wipe that out tomorrow and it wouldn't make a difference in this country because we are the richest, most powerful country on earth, and we don't care about that 1% GDP. So there's no infrastructure to accelerate it, to expand it. Now you add in the Hispanic population, and now you're up to less than 4% GDP. But think about this. Just between the Black and Hispanic populations together, they will represent 42% of the United States population by in the next 20 years, and they together produce less than 4% GDP. You cannot sustain the global competitiveness of this nation with so much of the population producing so little, and yet the systems that serve these communities are designed to cripple and incapacitate and debilitate these communities. So if we want to change those systems, let's start with schools. How do we fund schools? Everybody knows the state and local taxes, right? The federal government puts in about 55 billion, and the rest of the 700 billion dollars is produced by state and local taxes. And so in every state, they're governing how they fund the schools, but ubiquitously, all of the worst schools serve the most needy kids. And that cannot be by accident, that is by design, despite the fragmentation. So how are we going to fix that? Well, somebody mentioned something about the legislature, US Congress. I think that that's not a bad place to start if you want to focus on one thing, like fixing the schools. And not, when I say fixing the schools were designed to be the way they are. So what I really mean is by disrupting the current system to put a vision across the nation that all of our best schools will serve the most needy people. All of our best schools will be found serving the most vulnerable populations. How do we flip that script? Now there you're gonna find a lot of different activities that you need, a lot of different relationships, a lot of different strategies, and a lot of different funding mechanisms. But if you start with that vision that everywhere I go in this country, and if I ask the real estate agents, where are the best schools? They're going to point me to the most needy and most vulnerable and most economically starved communities. That's where we keep our best schools. I think that that is an opportunity for us if we just wanted to pick one place to start.
Great,
So
thank you so much.
I think that Mike brings up a really good point. Now, look, I always feel that Black-Jewish relations is truly a local issue. And so I actually wouldn't even think about the Congress. I would look at what is Chattanooga, what is the county that you're in, what are the issues really hyper local that you can, or maybe it's even a suburb of Chattanooga that's its own city. I don't know the geography and how it's set up specifically. But you should sort of look at it that way. A low barrier, but I'm still not even sure that this is something that I would put at the top of your agenda now. Like I personally believe that you should get 6 months into knowing each other, unless there's something like, unless voting rights you happen to know, or there's some education reform thing that you were able, to Mike's point, or economic empowerment thing that you know of right now. I would focus the beginning about the relationship piece, because I do think that that's where the long term, that's how the long term is really developed. I believe that bridge building is about the long term, and advocacy really is more about the short term. And you are, what it is that y'all are coming together for is really about the long term benefit of the Chattanooga community, not just not even the greater United States, just in the way that I view it. But perhaps you could elevate it a little bit to Tennessee, but I would keep it sort of locally focused. And sadly, you don't have any African-American elected officials in the U.S. Congress since Harold Ford Jr. Decided to run for Senate. So that's going to make it a little difficult.
Yeah, in Chattanooga and then right down in the Dalton area, I don't think our two reps are too interested in changing the education system at the moment. Maybe they could be convinced, but on a one issue basis. But overall, that's just not going to be their position.
No.
And I say that skeptically, but I also say that as a realist. But I think there's other ways that we can start changing the education, and that's the school board. I mean, we had a big win on the school board up where I lived. Our representative from the Signal Mountain area, and that was significant. So, making sure we pay attention to those elections. You get local. You don't get more local than your school board, and then city hall and not city hall, city council, and we do have a mayoral election that somebody brought up here too as well. I want to give one more question because we are right at 5 o'clock. And I'm sure people do want to go watch football, unless, the Titans. If you're a Titans fan, I apologize. It didn't go well today. But Marissa, you get the last question.
Sorry, I didn't mean to leave my hand up. That was a fake question.
Okay.
Well, then a big round of applause and a thank you for our speakers, Mike and Dove. Hopefully we will find more ways to connect and play our Jewish geography game too as well, Dove.
Yes.
And I look forward to these continued partnerships and dialogues. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Thank you again, Deborah, for making the arrangements. And I do encourage everyone to take a look and see about signing up for at least one film from that documentary series, because I think that one will be incredibly engaging and enlightening. So thank you, and have a great rest of the day.
Thanks for having me.
Have a good week.
Thank you so much. And Bill Hicks, thank you, Rabbi Lewis, all of you, Mike, Dove. Now we know where you live.
Deborah, this is Richard. Do you know, or Bill or anybody, did we have an active Black-Jewish dialogue during Mayor Burke's 8 years from the city government perspective?
We had a Black-Jewish dialogue when it was created years ago. Ruth Holmberg, the president, chief editor of the Chattanooga Times, helped create it, and it went on pretty much with the Urban League locally. However, many of the people moved away or passed away, and I don't believe it has started up again until I started this in the summer last year. So while there is the Council Against Hate that Mayor Burke created, there is not this dialogue embedded within it. And just so people know, when we have a change of mayors, I don't know what will happen with the Council Against Hate, but we will continue on. Okay?
Yes.
Right. The work never ends. All right, guys. Again, thank you so much. And let's pray for better days coming. And may they be soon.
Here, here.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.